Thank you for attending the Religion and Philosophy Club's event today. Our guest speaker is originally from Detroit, Michigan. He obtained a PhD in Hispanic Studies from Michigan State University in 2010. Currently, member of faculty at Bates College, where he serves as assistant professor of Spanish and is affiliated with faculty members with the Latin American Studies program. His work examines race, slavery, and Afro-Caribbean religiosity in Black colonial literature, with emphasis on poetry and prose of 19th century Cuban writers. His essays are published in Palara, the Zora Neale, Hearst and Forum, American Studies, and the internationally acclaimed Cuban journal, Del Caribe. His latest publication is The Altar, the Oath, and the Body of Christ, in Jerome Branche's anthology, Black Writing, Culture, and the State in Latin America. He currently has a book in progress entitled Black Cuban Literature in the Age of Conspiracy, Race, Religion, and Ritual in Juan Francisco Manzaro, Gabriel Obla Concepcion Valdez. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Matthew Pettway.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here at the University of Maine. Though I've been in Maine for some time, this is probably the first time. This is the first time I've actually been in Farmington, believe it or not. And so this is, for me, a very exciting opportunity. And my chicken scratch, I think, got in the way of some of those pronunciations. So you know, if it caused you to chuckle, you know, it's probably based on the way that I write. But today, I want to give a talk entitled, as you can see here, The Altar, the Oath, and the Body of Christ, Ritual Poetics in Cuban Racial Politics of 1844. And I'm asking a series of questions today concerning the relationship between loyalty, symbolic practice, and sacred authority. Loyalty, symbolic practice, and sacred authority. The topics that I deal with, race, slavery, transculturation, and religion, tend to be very dense. And a lot of times when I present these things to my students, I find myself in a situation where I need to not only explain, but to kind of situate the characters that I'm talking about and try to introduce concepts that will facilitate understanding. I understand there's many people here today, however, at the University of Maine that study religion, and so I'm confident that much of what I'm saying will be legible, and if it's not, hopefully at lunch we can clear it up. I want to especially thank the Philosophy and Religion Club, as well as Professor Jennifer Reid for the invitation. Today there's 2 to 3 questions that I'm asking you to consider as I begin this conversation about 2 anti-colonial, anti-slavery conspirators, one by the name of José Amores and another who went by the name Fermín Ganga. Ganga being an interesting surname, not something that would have been assigned him by his owner or enslaver, but a name that he chose for himself. And it's the latter of the 2 conspirators that I want to place emphasis on today. The first was a sacristan in the Catholic Church in the early 19th century in the Spanish colony of Cuba, a colony that remained very much in the grip of the Spanish Empire of Queen Isabella II, or Isabel II in Spanish, long after other parts of Spanish America had freed themselves, and Brazil, in fact, had become independent. And the second, Fermín Ganga, was himself an African-born person, believed to be from West Africa. We're not exactly sure where he was from, but we believe it was either Sierra Leone or Liberia. And so it's the way in which these 2 men come into contact with one another that I want to frame the story. So what are the 2 questions? One is, I want to ask you to consider What is the power of the oath? And to whom do I swear allegiance? To whom do I swear allegiance? When the lights are off, when no one else is in the room, when I'm alone with my thoughts, to whom am I loyal? To whom am I faithful, and why? I want us to ask, what happens when the holiest sacrament of Christianity becomes, and I'll use this word loosely, the property of African religious practitioners? And when I refer to the holiest sacrament in Christianity, you'll know that I'm talking about the Eucharist, otherwise known as the host or the body of Christ. So if anyone has gone, any of you have gone to church on a good day, when you're being a practicing Catholic or a practicing Protestant, you'll remember that the minister will hand you that little wafer of bread. Sometimes the churches that I went to, it was just bread. And so I don't know if we were as holy as the Catholics, we Protestants. But that little wafer is understood to be the transubstantiated body of Christ. Christ himself, and I must say himself, in physical form, that we are to take into ourselves to remember his death on the cross, his sacrifice for us, as well as to make us holy. So what happens when that is no longer the property of the church? In order to begin my lecture today, it's necessary to talk about what is, quite frankly, the most discomfiting topic in the United States. I would say today, but I believe always, and that is race. How do you talk about race in an age of an African-American presidency? How do you talk about race in an age where the first African-American president puts on the Supreme Court two women, one which refers to herself as a wise Latina? Those are Justice Sotomayor's words, not my words, though she probably is wise and she's on the Supreme Court after all. How do you talk about race at a time where religious minorities in the United States find themselves assailed for their religious identity? I think that you do so by defining what race is and what race is not. Webster's dictionary has a way, and this is the dictionary definition I looked at when I was younger, of describing race in terms of that which is passed on through blood, that which is sure, which is certain, that which is hereditary. But race actually is not biological reality. Race is, quite frankly, a social, historic construct. And so now, as a professor of Spanish and Latin American studies, as someone who studied literature, I'm entering into the domain of the sociologist. I'm thinking of Howard Wynett, Racial Conditions, just for a moment, because I want you to think about race as something that seems so incredibly fixed, but is actually based on insignificant phenotypical differences, 0.1% of our genetic makeup. Race is posited as the natural order of things, but it's actually a system of inclusions and definitions that determine economic privilege for some groups while denying those privileges to others. It is social engineering backed up by social practice and institutional mechanisms. One example of that in the Spanish-American Empire, the Spanish-American Empire that can be said to begin in the late 15th century and last until 1898 when Spain loses power over Cuba, was the role of the church. Who could be a priest in the Catholic Church? And the only persons, according to legislation, that could be priests were white male persons. So those are the persons that had a privilege that was defined by law. The Spanish went to much trouble to make sure that that privilege would not then be passed on to others of mixed race. But there was a shortage of priests on the island of Cuba, and so they had to find a way to fill that gap. White Cuban men were not interested, for the most part, in becoming priests. And so we have the story of an African-descended sacristan by the name of Jose Amores, who himself became a priest. And this is the story that I'll be talking about today. In the shadow of the Haitian Revolution, from 1791 to 1804, free and enslaved persons of African descent organized a series of insurrections designed to abolish slavery, depose the Spanish military government, and boldly institute a new republic of blacks and mulattoes on the island. Government interrogations confirmed the chief conspirators had initiated their plans in 1841 and subsequently concealed the plot by compelling would-be rebels to swear unconditional allegiance to give up their lives before revealing anything to their white enemies. To this end, loyalty oaths were a pervasive means to effectively organize anti-slavery revolts, maintain secrecy, and ensure unity among insurgents. The 1844 movement particularly alarmed colonial authorities because it enjoyed widespread appeal among blacks, effectively recruited both enslaved and free persons, and was composed of multiple nuclei that traversed the urban-rural divide. Now, I want to explain a bit why loyalty oaths was important, and I think part of what will help to explain that is to show a map of Cuba. I always think of Cuba as una ceja, an eyebrow. President Obama was just there in Havana. At least I don't think he got too far outside of Havana. But Cuba is today a population of a little more than 11 million. Just imagine how much smaller that population must have been in the colonial period. We're talking about cities in the thousands, not even necessarily the hundreds of thousands, but the thousands. And so any type of disturbance in the social level would spread quickly. Word of mouth was, in some communities, as important as newspapers were for a literate elite. Loyalty oaths had both a political and spiritual significance. Members of the chief junta inducted Cuban and African-born persons alike through ritual initiations wherein would-be rebels pledged abiding allegiance to the cause. Loyalty oaths involved the transgressive appropriation of Catholic rituals. And so in Cuba, the official religion of the colony and throughout Spanish America, it's also true in Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony, and Catholicism was the official religion. And so persons of African descent were proselytized, they were baptized, it was a necessary thing, whether they were free or enslaved. It didn't necessarily mean that the church was all powerful in their lives, but it definitely meant that in the public sphere, they needed to comport themselves in a certain way. I want to talk about a couple of the symbolic practices that were I would use the word transculturated, but I want to say some more that were appropriated in the process of planning anti-slavery rebellions. And one is a sign of the cross. I hope I'm doing that right. Like I said, I'm a Protestant and a bad Protestant at that. But I believe that's how it goes. And so that's one of the things. Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, one of the two poets that I'm writing my book on, Black Cuban Literature in the Age of Conspiracy, Race, Religion, and Ritual, used the sign of the cross to seal an oath to ensure the people that he was speaking to, the Africans and the African descendants, that this was something serious, this was something that they should, a movement they should swear allegiance to, and something they should be willing to die for. But another thing was, and I found one instance of this, and this is the instance I want to discuss today, is the example of a sacristan whose responsibility is to maintain the purity, the cleanliness of the vessel in which the host or the Eucharist, once again the body of Christ, is found, takes that Eucharist and gives that to an enslaved person that he's in the process of recruiting to be part of an anti-slavery movement. Jose Amores, once again, was a sacristan, and Fermin Ganga was the enslaved person. So today I'll be talking about the second half of that ritual process, what Fermin Ganga might have done religiously and theologically in that moment. Now, loyalty oaths were a grave threat to the Spanish government because there was no separation of church and state in the Spanish Empire. Persons that swore such oaths effectively broke faith with the church and the colonial state at the same time. The oath is an inherently religio-political utterance. As Italian theorist Giorgio Agamben says, the oath is, quote, the originary performative experience of the word, end quote. Therefore, it is the oath that gives explanation to jurisprudence and religious faith. The oath event is both a speech act intended to swear faithfulness and consecrate the human being through the word. J.L. Austin says that the speech act considers the entirety of the situation in which speech occurs in order to establish a parallel between statements and performative utterances. Austin envisions the issuing of a performative utterance as the realization of a deed. So the utterance is not simply something that floats out there in the ether, but it plays a role in constructing reality, in sealing pacts. And I want to use what is perhaps one of the simplest examples. It's the example that J.L. Austin used in his work, now over half a century old. And that is the example of what we call in the African American community, jumping the broom, breaking the glasses, crossing over, the old ball and chain. What happens when you get married? What must you say? I do, you know. So that moment, when both women, both men, or man and a woman have said I do, that seals the oath, that oath of allegiance between the two. So I'm taking that relationship between speech and performance, and I'm theorizing a notion that I'm calling ritual poetics. Ritual poetics, something that has been theorized in African American theater studies, but I'm speaking of it in a different way today. Ritual poetics are verbal practices performing language as sacred discourse, but sacred discourse that's inscribed on the body. Ritual poetics derives its power from the speech act's capacity to manifest language in everyday circumstance, having been forged through the intractable conflict and asymmetrical dialogue between disparate spiritual traditions in the Cuban colonial context. I acknowledge the top-down relationship between the sacristan, Jose Amores, and Fermin Ganga. But I recognize that that's the result of imperial standards. It doesn't necessarily reflect African-descended political organization. And since Jose Amores was himself a person of African descent, we don't know exactly what his relationship looked like with his congregants. But the fact that he's said to have seduced, this is the word of the Spanish government, the psychosexual notion of conspiracy, to have seduced 24 different people, you can imagine there was quite a bit of back and forth because he would have had to convince them of this conspiracy. Once again, where do your allegiances lie? This lecture tells a story of loyalties betrayed, of persons unfree that risked life and limb to challenge the Spanish Empire in an effort to conquer freedoms they had been denied. In 1844, the Spanish military tribunal responsible for investigating what triggered a series of insurrections told a compelling story of their own about a religious man charged with upholding the sacred duties of the church that had betrayed that trust in order to enlist other blacks in revolutionary struggle against empire. The government narrative alleged that African-descended sacristan Jose Amores had seduced Fermin Ganga, an enslaved captive from West Africa, to partake in a widespread conspiracy, quote, to exterminate the white population, end quote. As the government story goes, Jose Amores recruited dozens of persons into the genocidal plot, and what is more, he availed himself of the sacred authority of the Catholic Church in order to deceive his proselytes and mislead the children of God in an unholy alliance against the natural order of things. But the military tribunal seems to have been most alarmed by the way Amores chose to recruit Fermin Ganga in the 1844 movement. Under interrogation, Fermin Ganga not only claimed that Jose Amores had urged him to take an oath, but also that the sacristan had presented him with the consecrated vessels and obliged him to seal his vow by kissing the ciborium. So I want to take a moment here to show you a couple of things, because I think that we need visual aids. We learn from listening and we learn from seeing things. This is an image of the church in San Pablo de Bainoa, a structure that's in the process of being, I want to say, renovated. It's a small town not too far from Matanzas, south of Matanzas. And we believe that this may have been the very church where Jose Amores acted as father of the church, where he acted as a priest. We should remember that because of the racial order, he was not legally allowed to become a priest, but he acted as a sacristan. He developed a relationship to the congregants where he was himself father of the church. He developed an edifice of authority around his position. So Catholicism functioned in some ways to change the orientation of persons of African descent to the material and spiritual world, but once the religious materials were in the hands of Africans and in the hands of persons of African descent, what precisely would happen with those materials is a different question. I want to evoke Fernando Ortiz's notion of transculturation and trying to understand what happened on that day to the host from the position of this West African man, Fermin Ganga. So this is an image of the church, and I think this is Caravaggio. Caravaggio is where Jose Amores was from. I'm not sure when this church itself was constructed, but I do believe the first image is from the 19th century, the town where Jose Amores actually performed his duties. If you are practicing Catholic, you may have seen something similar to this before. This is the ciborium. En español se llama el sagrario, And this is where the body of Christ would be placed. I found another image of it because I wanted the audience to be able to imagine just how small that space is, and to consider from a Spanish Catholic point of view specifically, how holy the body of Christ is. If Christ indeed died for the sins of the world, and all mankind and womankind or humankind are deemed sinful, then there is no salvation without him. His body is something to be ingested, to be revered, to be worshipped, because his sacrifice made our lives and our eternal redemption possible. And so in the statement against, the sentence against Jose Amores and Fermin Ganga, there's a sense of indignation. And I want to talk about that government narrative a bit more now. And I'm going to ask you to pull out the sheets that you have. I'm convinced that this will help us to return to the 19th century by having the images and having the text in front of us. I've translated this. I didn't put the Spanish original. I thought it might take up too much paper. But I want us to think for a minute about the government story, and then I want to posit an alternative viewpoint, an alternative story. The government narrative of 1844 is a violent story of intrigue and chaos, designed to manipulate entrenched white suspicions of black ambitions for political power. All the while, the government narrative silenced African-descended aspirations for the abolition of slavery and the establishment of a society based on racial egalitarianism. The official narrative goes something like this. In 1844, Jose Amores seduced and initiated 24 different people into a broad conspiracy to annihilate the peaceful white inhabitants, take possession of the island, and commit, and this is important, this is very gendered, commit unspeakable acts on defenseless white women. I will cite extensively from the sentencia, the sentence, in order to provide the precise context in which Amores administered such an oath. Quote, "The freedmen penetrated the farms, the country roads, and even the bohíos themselves, disseminating their maleficent ideas. They haven't concerned themselves with anything else for some time now. The seed had penetrated in all directions, and they only needed a sign to set in motion such a horrifying sacrifice," end quote. So I want to explicate this text a bit here before moving to the next passage, which is much longer and discusses Fermín Ganga and José Amores. The language of penetration is probably the first thing that stands out to you, but there's another two words that also have a very strong psychosexual content, and that would be disseminate, right, as in semen, and seed, as in semen. So I want you to ask, why would the Spanish government, the military commission, find these language, the most effective language, for convincing a frightened white public, which was by this time in Cuba a demographic minority, of the danger of the conspiracy? There's no mention of the torture of enslaved persons. There's no mention of the fact that children are being sold. There's no mention of the fact that that slave persons are working sun up to sundown. There's no mention of the righteousness of the cause of those that are fighting. Instead, there's a construction of innocence on one end and villainy on the other. Can we come somewhere to understand this? Seditious sacristan, quote, among the infinite schemes that they have employed to seduce and astonish the slave masses are atrocious and unmentionable acts. Such is the plan executed by one of the chief spokesmen, not content with increasing his proselytes through ordinary oaths and death threats. He trampled on the most sacred and respected item of all Christians, the most sacred and respected item of all Christians. He had the audacity to remove the ciborium of the holiest sacrament from the tabernacle, and obliging a slave to kiss it, he made him swear his support to the exterminator party, promising stealth and offering to die before revealing anything to the whites. So testifies Fermín Ganga of Don Antonio Garcia Flores on record sheet 937, who swore such a severe oath. This audacious and sacrilegious mulatto exercised the function of the sacristan. He called himself father of the church and was supposed to give the first mass in the town of Caraballo, giving thanks to the Almighty after having consummated such an atrocious plan. And there's a second piece there that I won't read. The plan is called atrocious, horrible acts, unmentionable. I want to get inside of that. I want to try to think about the relationship between language, authority, and symbolic practice. Colonial society is represented in the sentencia, an Hispano-Catholic language, as a divinely sanctioned social structure besieged by vicious persons who would pervert its holy mission and its natural hierarchy. The judgment against the town of Bainoa is the official government narrative of the events of 1844 that makes explicit claims to veracity in order to justify the imprisonment, torture, executions, and coercive expatriations of enslaved and free persons of African descent thought to be involved in the plot. Sanctioned by Queen Isabella II of Bourbon, the sentencia reads as a biting refutation of conspiracy and revolt. And I want to take this moment now to discuss another story. If, as the military tribunal claimed, José Amores knowingly appropriated and refashioned the symbolic practices of Catholicism in accordance with a revolutionary theology, so that the tools of normative religious discourse became tools of uprising, what was Fermín Ganga's relationship to those same symbolic practices? So the piece that I'm speaking on today comes from a book chapter of the same title, The Altar, the Oath, and the Body of Christ. And it's published by Jerome Branche, a book called Black Writing, Culture, and the State in Latin America, which just came out last October after much waiting. Those things take a while, though. And in the essay, I explore two theological moments. The first theological moment being that of José Amores, what José Amores might have understood with regard to the body of Christ. How might he have interpreted and understood it? And I theorize that he would have looked at it as a suffering body, but as a black body that would be unified in the struggle against Spanish Empire, against the injustice of Spanish Empire. And I use black Cuban not Black Cuban, excuse me, Black Catholic theology in order to theorize that moment where the body of Christ becomes the lynched body, the body on the lynching tree. Think the U.S. South less than 60 years ago. Think James Byrd. Think colonial Cuba. But Fermin Ganga had a different orientation to spirituality. So I want to talk about his relationship to this very same thing. And don't think that the body of Christ for him becomes a body that is indeed a Black Christ, but rather that is transculturated with an African divine spirit that he himself would have known and revered. So let's think for some moment before I get back to the nitty-gritty of this or the reading of this. Let's imagine that we're in that small church in San Pablo de Bainoa, and we have two men, at least two men present. We don't know if there are other proselytes there, because the record says that Jose Amores recruited 24 persons and was accused by 36 persons of conspiracy, which makes it very likely that he was involved in serious recruitment efforts. But there's only one text, only one historical text that tells us anything about Jose Amores, and it's the Sentencia. It's so large, it's at Harvard University. It's so large that I couldn't put it in a PowerPoint presentation. But I want us to think for a moment again about that ciborium, the body of Christ, this being the holiest sacrament, and to think about the ways in which that which is holy is understood in different cultures. So there is a particular African divine spirit with whom not only Christ, but particularly the Eucharist has been transculturated, has been strongly associated. And the name of that particular divine spirit is Obatala. And Obatala is, and I think it's very important to point this out, is the embodiment of purity. He's the embodiment of purity. His color is white. He is the leader of the other divine spirits, his pantheon of divine spirits. And he has a special relationship with the Supreme Being. So if we think of it comparatively, using Christianity as a base, at least from an epistemological standpoint, from a knowledge standpoint, we can understand why Obatala would be associated with Jesus Christ, and not only with Jesus Christ, but with the holiest sacrament, with the Eucharist, with the host, la hostia, as they say in Spain. So I have an image here of Obatala that I'd like to show. And you can see here that Obatala is a Black African person, that Obatala is associated with a horse, that Obatala, though pure, is also a warrior spirit. I wouldn't say that he's primarily identified with his warrior characteristics, but he is definitely capable of warfare and maintains a special relationship with Olodumare, the name for the Supreme Being in Yoruba, a Nigerian language. So I'm talking right here about a Yoruba or Yoruban cosmology that has a relationship to Fermin Ganga. In an effort to reconstruct Fermin Ganga's religious subject position, I will briefly discuss some of the scholarship regarding African captives imported to Cuba under the name Ganga. My intentions are not historiographical. Rather, I aim to do an innovative cultural studies reading of an implicit African subjectivity that the government narrative might otherwise have expunged from official history. African captives, known as Ganga, G-A-N-G with an accent on the A, in colonial Cuba did not constitute a uniform ethnic or religious grouping. Alessandra Basso Ortiz concurs with Jesus Guanche that Sierra Leone and Liberia represented the geographic region where the so-called Ganga originated, but her analysis excludes Guinea and the Ivory Coast, and he considers those two as possible places of origin. Moreover, she recognizes that only 7 Ganga groups for whom there is explicit evidence in the archival record. Basso Ortiz concludes that the Ganga should not be associated with the Mandingo or exclusively classified as speakers of West African Atlantic languages. According to Manuel Barcia, Africans known in Cuba as Ganga were involved in every form of anti-slavery resistance in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were often conspiratorial leaders and participants in anti-slavery revolts, sabotage, and marronage. The plantation was their primary sphere of resistance. Notwithstanding ethnic incongruities, historians agree that persons known as Ganga were frequently involved in anti-slavery resistance, and they played a role in the 1844 movement that both José Amores and Fermín Ganga were a part of. Histories of the 1844 movement mention persons carrying the ethnonym Ganga, or the ethnic name Ganga, who accessed ritual powers as tools of insurgency. So one of the difficulties that we have, historians, or definitely we literary and cultural studies scholars have, is how do we look into the archive, find the name of an African-born person that's been enslaved, or Cuban-born, or Brazilian-born, or Peruvian-born person, and then somehow, as Charles Long would say, crawl back through history to determine their origins, both ethnically, perhaps linguistically, and culturally. How do we do that? And Jesus Guanche and Basso Ortiz, two Cuban scholars, they've done very good work in the Cuban context trying to understand what Ganga meant. The work that they've done determines that Sierra Leone and Liberia are the places where the folks called Ganga in Cuba would most likely have come from. And there's recent work that has been done by an Australian scholar that's confirmed that. She has a documentary out. I cannot remember the name of it right now, but I'm sure I can find it on Google later. But the documentary confirms that there's Cubans living in Matanzas today that sing ritual songs that are still sung in Liberia. And those Cubans in the documentary return to Liberia. So Fermín Ganga is not merely a figment of our imagination. He's somebody that indeed existed and that indeed constructed a cultural identity in dialogue with Christianity. So I want us to think about transculturation as the unifying, but the coming together of different cultural strands. Catholicism presenting itself in a hegemonic way as the official religion, and African persons recognizing its social legitimacy and the fact that it is reinforced in terms socially reinforced, as well as reinforced through violence on occasion, and needing then to see themselves and to see their notion of the divine in Christian practice. This is how, if I can explain this well, this is how the holiest sacrament might be understood to be yet another manifestation of Obatala, yet another manifestation of the divine spirit or the Orisha most associated with purity. Sociologist of Cuban religions Wallene Dotson says that, quote, ritual processes of initiation, end quote, take place within sacred spaces, making use of collective rites to incorporate new adherents into ritual families. The ritual ceremonies impart explicit socialization instructions, end quote, for the new community members. Fermín Ganga's resolve to swear an oath administered by José Amores should be read as a covenant between two interlocutors who shared disparate subject positions. Notwithstanding the disparity in social status and the apparent difference in religious practice, both persons were cognizant of the intrinsic life force embedded in the spoken word to actualize revolution. In light of this, I maintain that Fermín Ganga coalesced the African-derived sacred knowledge of his nación, his nation, with José Amores' already transculturated understandings of the divine to forge a third ritual space. And so the notion of transculturation is that when in a colonial environment, and I'm speaking specifically about a colonial environment, where you have radical inequality, certain human beings that can buy and sell others, certain human beings that can dispense with the life of others, the wave of a hand, where the notion of social rights, political rights really doesn't exist, even though there were certain protections in the law for enslaved persons and penalties for enslavers or for masters that passed a certain limit. Even though all that existed in practice, often those laws were not respected. In such an environment, how then do people dialogue with one another? What is the wink wink, the nod that people give one another in order to create something, and I'm thinking about the enslaved right now, to create something that will meet their spiritual needs and their need for liberation? This is that third ritual space. This is that transculturated practice. African divine spirits manifest themselves in myriad ways as to communicate with practitioners through different paths. I want to talk about the Ganga in Cuba. There's one group of Ganga in Cuba, and this is the one that the Australian scholar was able to identify, called Ganga Longoba. Ganga Longoba is the sacred equivalent of Obanla, La Vieja. La Vieja is the sacred equivalent of Obanla. And Obanla is a path to Obatala. So in the tradition of the Nigerian-based religions, Obatala is strongly associated in one of his manifestations, in one of his paths, with the holiest sacrament, the body of Christ, because of his purity. And he's a warrior, as is Jesus in the book of Revelation, tribe of Judah. In the Ganga tradition, La Vieja, another African divine spirit, has been strongly associated with Obatala. He's the equivalent of one of Obatala's manifestations. Considering that La Vieja was transculturated with Las Mercedes and Santa Ana in Catholicism, she cannot be equated with the holiest sacrament, which Africans have associated with Oduduwa. Oduduwa is one of the paths of Obatala that has been identified and transculturated with the body of Christ. Obatala is the Orisha, or the divine spirit of creation, and the chief of the Orishas. That is, the divine supernatural beings that govern natural phenomena. More than any other divine spirit, Obatala is especially influential in dealings with the supreme being, which I said before is known as Olodumare. In Yoruban cosmology, Obatala is known as the owner of the heads, and the head stands for holiness, saintliness, and divinity. The head is understood to determine the destiny, to some degree, of the individual. And so, although in Ganga traditions in Cuba, in modern Cuba, so we're talking about modern ethnography, La Vieja, the divine spirit associated with Obatala, is not directly tied to the holiest sacrament, I want to make a connection between Obatala, the warrior spirit, and this oath event of Fermin Ganga. In my estimation, Jose Amores' transformation of the holiest sacrament into a black Christ should not be read as a defilement, but instead analyzed from the vantage point of the righteousness of the rebel cause. Although the Ganga Longoba did not transculturate La Vieja with Oduduwa, or with the holiest sacrament, such a religious prism does associate her with the supreme being. So the reader is at liberty to relate her maternal saintliness with that of Olodumare's son. The reader is at liberty to associate La Vieja, who is also Obatala, with the holiest sacrament. As Natalia Bolivar has clarified, actually let me skip down here to a different part here for reasons of clarification. Fermin Ganga constructs his subjectivity in relation to that of Jose Amores in hopes of achieving an agency that both were denied. From Fermin Ganga's perspective, I argue that the willing pact between both conspirators is not an abomination, as alleged by the government scribe, but a spiritual and political covenant between brethren of African descent unified in a resistance movement with revolutionary potential. Resistance practices and warfare are consistent with the Afro-Cuban conceptions of Obatala. In some Cuban households of worship, Oduduwa, which is one of the paths of Obatala, is conceived as a warrior spirit on horseback wielding a machete. As you can see here, he's on horseback. That's not so much a machete as much as that is a sword. Obatala is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, possessing the same characteristics that belong to the Supreme Being. When Fermin Ganga takes the body and blood of Christ, he is partaking in a body that has been darkened, if you will, by the ritual poetics of the oath administered him. In the religio-political logic of Fermin Ganga Jose Amores' ritual, Jesus Christ of Nazareth is black. But in the case of Fermin Ganga, the black body of Christ is again transfigured, this time being rendered as Obatala. I maintain that Fermin Ganga's transculturation of the Blessed Sacrament amounts to a second theological moment. The omniscient warrior will lead the sacristan and formerly enslaved recruit in battle as they strive to abolish racial slavery and enshrine a new order of things. The oath event embodies and performs the power of the spoken word so that it is, as Agamben says, quote, a consecration of the living human being through the word to the word, end quote. And I want to move here to wrap up, move towards the end here. I want to return us to the question of where do our loyalty lies? To whom do we plead allegiance and why? What is our relationship, or what is the relationship between symbolic practice, the oath? The oath that Jose Amores administered and Fermin Ganga professed signified disloyalty and rebellion to the racialized plantation order established and legitimated by the absolute power of the Spanish monarchy. Even so, Fermin Ganga's confession to the military commission breaks faith with the sacred covenant among African-descended brethren that he swore with Jose Amores. So the only way we know about this, presumably, this is what the sentencing document, the judgment, tells us, judgment against the town of Bainoa. The only reason we know this is because Fermin Ganga confessed it. So if the oath itself was dangerous to the Spanish government because it broke faith with the colonial state, disavowed the queen, right, and broke faith with the church, now Fermin Ganga, a co-religionist, has broken faith with Jose Amores, who was most definitely executed by the Spanish government, who was decapitated, whose head was impaled, like that of Nat Turner in the United States. After all, the passages I have been analyzing are government reconstruction of Fermin Ganga's confessions. The judgment reads, quote, he, Jose Amores, made him swear his support to the exterminator party, promising stealth and offering to die before revealing anything to the whites. So testifies Fermin Ganga of Don Antonio Garcia Flores, end quote. Fermin Ganga's detailed confession of Jose Amores' plot and the ritual they constructed in unison around the loyalty oath appears to have been part of an 11th hour strategy to save himself by denying culpability. It is not unreasonable to suppose that he was subjected to torture. Robert Paquette has established, and my research confirms, that the testimony from the latter conspiracy was highly problematic given that torture was used to extract confessions. By making Jose Amores a culprit, Fermin Ganga reinforced the racialized and gender dimensions of the government story. Fermin Ganga rendered himself an African victim, intellectually incapable of devising such a comprehensive and well-ordered scheme, so that the officer of the church becomes the likely perpetrator. So I want to think of, once again, Fermin Ganga as a political force himself. Not only is he transculturating the holiest sacrament to represent divine spirit that's associated with purity in his tradition, in his pantheon, but in a moment of crisis, he disavows the oath. And in so doing, he plays into the government story, knowingly plays into the government story that it was the lighter-skinned African descendants, the so-called mulattoes, and I know that's a pejorative, but that's the term that appears in the documentation, that the so-called biracial, the so-called mulattoes, those presumed to be closer to the church and to a false notion of civilization, they seduced me. I didn't really know what was going on. There are, of course, questions that remain unanswered. Some pertain to government silences and others that reflect a need to conduct further research about this particular case. What was the nature of Jose Amores' relationship with Fermin Ganga? Was Fermin Ganga a parishioner, a recent convert to Catholicism, or something else? Furthermore, did the promise of leniency motivate Fermin Ganga to confess? While we may be unable to satisfactorily answer the historical questions, I have tried to show that the government account does provide an opportunity for a counter-reading of conspiracy that reconstructs events, reads between the lines, and speaks when the text is silent. Thank you so much for your attention, engaging me in these difficult but important matters. Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you. We actually do not know. The sentencing document is the only source that I've been able to find in this voluminous testimony. The testimony about 1844 is so thick, it's so dense, copious, that historians haven't seen it all. The London Record Office has files on this. In Spain, the archives in Spain have files on this, or I should say documentation. Harvard University has some things. I learned some things from a private collection, working with a scholar by the name of Daisy Cuey Fernandez, who was a mentor of me in Cuba. And so it's possible that there's something else out there about Fermin Ganga, some more information, but to this point, I've only found one reference, or one historical source or archival source, I should say, that refers to both of them. So we don't know what happens to him. Because he confessed and disavowed the movement, and he was apparently able to appeal to the racist logic of the empire that he wouldn't have been capable of anything but a brute act of violence. He wouldn't have been capable of planning such a thing. Now, obviously, that's false. The Haitian Revolution demonstrates that that's false. But because he was able to appeal to it, he may have saved his life. He may have saved his life. He may have preserved his life. Some people were imprisoned. Some of the co-religionists of the 1844 movement were imprisoned. Both of the poets that I'm writing my book on were imprisoned. One of them was executed. That's the one that used the sign of the cross as to seal his oath. That's Gabriel de la Concepción Valdés or Plácido. Others were executed, like Plácido. Others were exiled. So we don't know what happened to him. I think it's very likely that his life was spared because of the information that he provided. But we don't know for sure. Yes, okay, yes.
You mentioned that because there was no separation of church and state, then joining the anti-slavery movement and rebelling against the Spanish state was also rejecting the church. But these days, Catholicism is still very common in the Caribbean countries. So I was wondering if there was a compromise going on, or what kind of, I mean, I suppose a chunk of this is in your thesis, but what kind of redefinition of Catholicism these anti-slavery rebels were acting?
Okay.
How their performance of Catholicism changed?
Okay, I want to make sure that I understand your question because it seems like there's quite a bit of depth to what you're asking. That you're interested in not only the role that Catholicism played in the Caribbean colonial societies, but the ways in which anti-slavery rebels might have changed Catholicism in the process of struggle.
Right, because they had to rebel, because they were rebelling against the Catholic state proposed to them by the Spanish. They had to change the way that they were doing Catholicism because it was so closely tied to that colonial power.
I would reference cultural anthropology that doesn't deal directly with anti-slavery insurrections, but deals instead with the ways in which enslaved people in Cuba since the 16th century, in fact, outside of long before the 1844 movement, which existed between 1841 and 1844, simply how they engaged the sacredness of their world. So I find the question very useful in the sense that it encourages me to think about other ways in which Catholicism might have changed in the process of struggle. I'm thinking about the sign of the cross being used. I'm thinking about another poet, and in fact, the only narrator of slavery in Latin America, Juan Francisco Manzano, who talks about, he gives credit to the saints, who could be also transculturated with the Orishas and the Yoruba traditions, Nigerian traditions, or the Impungus and the Bakongo tradition. So that would, and he gives credit to the saints, in the process of explaining why it is he was able to escape from Matanzas to Havana, to escape the form of slavery that he was suffering in Matanzas, to a less violent form in Havana, and eventually procure his freedom through manumission. I think that could be your specific question, I think, could be the topic of a book. And it probably would need to be something that's done by several scholars, not one. I don't think that could be a monograph. But with regard to the ways in which Catholicism was changed, we'd have to go back, in the Cuban context, we'd have to go back to the 16th century. I'm thinking of Wileen Dodson's book, Sacred Spaces in Oriente Cuba, because the first African captives that were brought to Cuba were brought from the Kingdom of the Congo, and they were Bakongo people. Many of them were Bakongo people, and they spoke a language called Kikongo. And so they came with, some of them came with some exposure to Christianity, but still maintained a relationship to the universe that was very different. For example, the forested wilderness was like a tabernacle in their tradition. It was a place where you go for medicinal purposes and to communicate with a divine entity or ancestors or spirits of the living dead. And so I would say that the best way to go about looking for an answer to that is to go back to those original moments and to ask what ways did Catholicism change in the process of transculturation, the long process of transculturation. And I'll just mention a couple of ways in which I'm familiar with it having changed. One thing is that symbolic practice like the sign of the cross didn't or ceased to mean what it is that the priest intended for it to mean. So you're thinking that this is a way of signaling the Holy Trinity. Well, then the Holy Trinity becomes, in the research the things that I've researched, less significant than the saints. The saints are more important because they're the intermediaries between between practitioners and Olodumare or Nsambi in the Congo traditions. They are the intermediaries between man and God or woman and God. And so they become very, very important, those intermediary spirits. Another way in which it's changed, and George Reid Andrews talks about this in Afro-Latin America very, very briefly, but he does a pretty good job. It's talking about the importance of African drumming. I do not know how to drum, but I would love to learn. But African drumming, and how African drumming itself, he talks about Montevideo, Uruguay, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I'm thinking of an example of the Congo de Villamella in the Dominican Republic. Once the African drums are brought in, that also means that that Africans had the ability, as they worshipped, the Virgin Mary or whatnot, they had the ability to invoke, the ancestors and spirits of the living dead. And so there's many ways in which it would have changed. And I think it's important to look at how it began to change even before insurrections, even outside of insurrections, simply because African persons were not tabula rasa when they were brought forcibly to what we now call the New World. When they were brought here, they came with knowledge systems, and so they merged those knowledge systems, engaged Catholicism through the lens of those knowledge systems. They're looking for clues to the presence of the divine spirits in their lives in this new situation of captivity. So I think if we approach it from that standpoint, we can eventually begin to answer, I think, a very complex and important question about what ways might Catholicism have changed in the process of struggle, or been changed by Africans and African descendants in the process of struggle. Thank you for that question, man. I hope that is a helpful answer.
Can I ask a smaller one?
Sure.
That I'm rephrasing sort of what I'm trying to get at. But do you believe, and maybe it's impossible to know, that Jose Morales was a Catholic, or was he wearing the costume?
Okay, now, I'm going to answer the question, and then I'm going to explain why I answered the way I'm going to answer it. I believe that he was a Catholic. I'm answering in that sense because African cosmologies, like the one that Fermin Ganga engaged, and that other African captives brought to Cuba, Brazil, Dominican Republic, United States, would have engaged, we're different from Western philosophies in the sense that they're not based on the principle of non-contradiction. So the principle of non-contradiction encourages us or drives us to say, well, why is he doing this if he is that? If he claims this identity, why is he doing the other? Where these cosmologies themselves were inter-epistemic. They're traditions that that encourage a confluence of beliefs where good and evil are not seen necessarily as absolute, ¿cuál la palabra que busco? Antitheses, but are understood rather as coexisting, uncomfortably so. There's no good without evil. My first article, Ritual and Reason, Negotiating Freedom in Juan Francisco Manzano, I begin to engage that notion with Manzano because he appeals to a saint, Saint Anthony or San Antonio, who's been transculturated with El Legua or Legba. Mundo Lucero is his name, the same saint's name in another tradition, the Bakongo-based tradition. So with the book, one of the challenges that I've had is how do I write about these poets and demonstrate that, yeah, there's resistance here, they're familiar with the redemption narrative of Catholicism and of Protestantism for that matter, but they're not calling on the Christian God for redemption. Instead, they're going to intermediaries in order to procure power so they can free themselves. And in the process of trying to understand that, I realized that it was not actually helpful, or I think even historically accurate, most likely. I don't think that they abjured everything about Catholicism. They're using Catholicism to their purposes. They're using Catholicism to their purposes because they don't necessarily, they understand, I believe they understood, I think Jose Amores understood, that Catholicism could easily be oppressive. It could easily be a tool of manipulation in certain hands. But if they were able to engage the Catholic saints or Jesus Christ himself, in the case of Obatala, right, through their own lens, then they would acquire power within this new religion without the priests necessarily knowing they had done so. So, any other questions?
I'll hold mine for lunch.
Okay.
Let you finish up.
Okay, well, I very much look forward to lunch. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.